Have you found yourself wondering if you're missing something? That you're doing all the things, acupuncture, massage, and core-focused workouts, but you're still experiencing recurring episodes of low back pain? You may be surprised to know that none of these things actually help to address the root cause of most cases of low back pain. In this episode, I'm going to show you the 3 vital steps to actually overcoming most cases of lower back pain so that you can actually move forward with your practice and wellness goals and stop taking 1 step forwards and 2 steps backwards every time you have a flare up. Welcome to the Empowered Yogi Method, where movement and neuroscience meets yoga and spirituality. I'm Cathy Aganoff, physiotherapist and yoga teacher, with over 20 years of experience helping yoga lovers overcome injuries and reclaim their yoga practice and lifestyle. I'm here to share with you my most valuable teachings to help you get off that recurring injury hamster wheel and get back to thriving on the mat. So I mentioned that there's these 3 things that you need to overcome lower back pain. And you may not know this about me, but I actually suffered with recurring lower back pain in my early years as a physio. And to be honest, I was missing all 3 of these components. 2 of them for sure. I had the first one sort of okay, but I knew what it was from my physio education, but for sure I hadn't embodied it, so I guess it doesn't really count. Once I figured this out, I spent a good 18 months working through these 3 steps in my own body. I had just started practicing yoga at this stage, and I was going through so many of those aha moments on the mat. Maybe you can relate, this experience where you're discovering all the little nuances of your movement on the mat, and it's like cha-ching and clarity dawns. And over 20 years now of helping clients overcome lower back pain, I've discovered time and time again that when one of these steps is missing, you usually remain stuck on that recurring hamster wheel of lower back pain. This frustrating cycle where you have a flare up, so you stop and rest. And maybe you have a few treatments. Eventually it resolves and you think it's all good. Or maybe it just returns to a manageable baseline. And so you go back to your normal life and yoga practice. And bam, it happens again. And every few months you find yourself back in the loop. You're constantly taking 1 step forwards and 2 steps backwards. And it's frustrating. And maybe you've just resigned yourself to the belief that this is just you now. That maybe you have your physio or osteo or massage appointments and you just learn to manage it and just live with it. But I also think that if you're here listening to this episode, then maybe there's also a part of you that senses deep down there is a solution that isn't about learning to live with it. And so if that sounds familiar to you, then keep on listening, dear yoga friend, because I'm about to show you all 3 components to healing lower back pain and what it looks like when one of the steps is missing. And by the end of this episode, you'll have clarity on which step you need to be giving more attention to and how to go about that. The good news is that if you are someone who's willing to roll up your sleeves and take full responsibility for your healing, there is a way to get off this injury hamster wheel for good. There's actually 3 things, as I mentioned, that you need to focus on. I'm going to give you all 3, and then I'm going to unpack it a little bit more so that you can hopefully get more clarity on which of these 3 you may be missing or not quite nailing. Okay, so diving right into the first one, which is to develop your neutral spine awareness. And it's the first pillar of my signature program, the Empowered Yogi Method. Essentially, this step is about learning how to find your neutral spine. There is some nuance to this step because you may have noticed this by glancing around in yoga class at your fellow yogis on the mat, that our anatomy is actually quite varied. Not so much that we have different bones. We're part of the same species, of course. but the shape and size of our bones varies a ton. And this actually creates a lot of variation in the range of motion in our joints. So because of this, your neutral spine may look a little different to the yogi on the mat next to you. And that is okay. There is no one size fits all neutral spine alignment here. But in saying that, the cues to adopt this position are much the same. How far you go with those cues may vary though. And there's actually 5 cues that I teach for nailing your neutral spine. And I'm going to teach you the first one now. But before I do, I want to tell you why this step is so important. And the reason is this: the neutral spine is the strongest position for the individual joints to buffer loads. In the neutral position, which for the spine is an S curve, the individual joints are evenly loaded from front to back and side to side. So any load placed on the spine in this neutral position is more evenly distributed, which prevents a concentration of load or stress in one part of the spine. You see, even standing in Tadasana, your spine is absorbing load. There's the load of your head and upper body traveling down from above through each segment of your spine. And there's the load from ground reaction forces traveling up through your feet, your legs, your hips, and up into your spine from below. Your spine is basically one big load transmission mechanism. And it's really important, I also mention here, so I'm not at risk of spreading any misinformation, that it's somehow bad or wrong to bend from your spine. Because our spine needs to be able to move in all directions and to do so regularly to be healthy and resilient. But while this is true, we also need to be strategic in loading the spine in the neutral position more of the time, especially when the load is higher or more repetitive, like is the case with bending, a movement that you most likely do more than 100 times a day. Not addressing this step usually results in overload of the spine over time because too much force concentrates in one area of the spine. Where exactly that point of overload concentrates varies from person to person because our movement and anatomy is so nuanced. For you, it could be higher up in the spine slightly. For someone else, it could be quite low down in the low back or in the SI joint even. The other example of overload from not adopting your neutral spine is in sitting. If you don't have a good neutral spine awareness, then you're most likely to swing between 2 misalignments when you're sitting at your computer or sitting in general. The most obvious one is being slumped, sitting slumped. And then what do you do when you realize that you're slumping? Maybe when you were a kid, it was your mum or your teacher that said, sit up straight. And so you swing from a slump to a military type posture and puff out your chest, both of which are missing the mark. Getting this step dialed in is critical for healing your low back issues. And to be totally transparent, it really requires some expert guidance to navigate in the beginning. But once you learn this and it becomes hardwired into your brain's blueprint, then you're empowered with the neural circuitry. So it's yours. It's not something that you can unlearn. Unlike when you receive a passive treatment, it's something that's actually hardwired into your brain. When you get up off that treatment table after a manual adjustment, you inevitably go back to the way your spine positioned itself before you lay down on the bed, based on your brain's blueprint for spine alignment and movement. So this is why I'm such an advocate for the Empowered Yogi Method of rewiring your posture and movement patterns, because nothing changes long term unless you change at a neurological level. If you can get this right, it will not only contribute to your recovery from recurring lower back pain, but it will allow you to keep practicing yoga and any other type of beloved activities that you enjoy without having to stop. So you don't have to miss out on all of the great side benefits you get from yoga and other forms of exercise, like maybe walking or running. like that boost in your mental health that you get. Getting this step right is like laying the foundation and frame of a house. If it's solid and aligned, everything built on top is stable, balanced, and able to withstand pressure from all sides. But remember, you don't have to live in neutral, just visit it more often. Okay, so as promised, the first cue for a neutral spine. This is the first of 5, and it's not intended to be practiced individually. So please take this in just as a concept here, not something to practice on its own too much. I will go deeper in a future episode and unpack all 5 so that you can learn this properly. For now, I just want you to visualize it and understand the concept of your neutral spine and why it's important. So if you are laying on your back in supine with your knees bent up and your feet on the floor, the first cue is to lengthen your tailbone down towards the floor to create a slight curve in your low back. You could imagine there's a marshmallow positioned in the center of your low back that you're trying not to squash. You're lightly touching this imaginary marshmallow, but not squashing it down into the floor. Okay, see if you can just visualize this for a moment. Or you can have a go at doing it if you can get down onto the floor easily. This action of lengthening the tailbone down towards the floor positions the low back and sacrum in their neutral position. As I mentioned, to receive the benefit, you really need all 5 cues working together, and I'll share these in a future episode. But now, let's say that you've addressed component 1. You know all 5 key elements of alignment for a neutral spine. You've practiced it and importantly embodied it, and it's now part of your brain's blueprint. Now we actually have to start building the capacity of the muscles around the spine to be able to help to buffer the loads put on the spine. AKA, we need to start strengthening the surrounding muscles in a strategic way that balances out the loads and creates more effective load buffering for the joints. I call this second component core stability, which is the second pillar we address in EYM. This step is not about doing more abdominal core workouts. In fact, too much focus on abdominal strengthening can actually unbalance the forces acting on the spine, making it worse. Trying to fix your back pain by only doing ab exercises is like fixing 3 flat tires by overinflating the remaining 1. It throws everything off balance. So this step is about targeting not just the front body muscles like the abs, but also the back body muscles like the glutes and the deep core stability muscles. And doing so in combination with your neutral spine awareness. Another common mistake I see many people making in attempting to strengthen their glutes as a way to help improve their core stability is doing global exercises like squats and lunges. The complexity of the movement and the load level is usually too high for someone who has a history of lower back pain, which has resulted in inhibition of the glutes. All you end up doing is putting more load on your quads, your thigh muscles, and the back muscles to do the work. You see, your brain has various blueprints for how it executes movement. And if your brain's blueprint doesn't involve a strong connection to your glutes, then when you do squats or lunges, you're not actually targeting your glutes. They end up just getting bypassed. Apart from having a history of low back pain, which causes inhibition of your glutes, there's also the issue of our sitting epidemic, which has caused most people I see to have grossly underactive glutes from just sitting on them all day and losing the strong blueprint for engaging them from normal everyday movements. Okay, so because of this, there's a strategic way we need to go about this step of core stability. You usually can't get away with just a general strength or weights program at the gym. Okay, so what about the third component, which I call developing your hip hinge strategy? This is where you learn to shift your dominant movement strategy or pattern from a spine dominant strategy to a hip dominant strategy. You see, most people unknowingly move about with the fulcrum of their movement during, say, bending. The fulcrum is somewhere up in the lower spine. This is usually because of prolonged sitting and underactive glutes and that lack of neutral spine awareness. So your brain has this strong blueprint for moving from your spine and an underdeveloped or weak blueprint for moving from the hips. And when you learn to move from your hips, you get this incredible load buffering capacity. Because when you move from your hips, you can maintain your neutral spine, which also has that optimized load buffering effect. And the activation of the glutes and the deep hip flexors is also increased by the hip hinge. So you get this supercharged load buffering capacity during bending as compared to bending over with the fulcrum of movement up in the lower spine. Relying on the spine to move about instead of the hips as your dominant pattern is like piling everything onto a bicycle when you're moving house instead of hiring a removalist truck to get the job done. The hips and glutes are built for the heavy lifting and repetition, while the lower back is better for steering and support. The hips and glutes are structurally built to handle load, while the lumbar spine isn't. What I've found over 20 years of working with clients with low back pain, that when you combine all three of these components, you get this optimized healing effect. You not only get better and actually recover your injury long term, but you get better quicker because you're not continually taking one step forwards and two steps backwards, never getting off the injury hamster wheel. And you gain this incredible resilience, not just to physical demands like yoga poses and other activities you might enjoy, maybe like hiking or running, but also the mental and emotional resilience that helps you to navigate and overcome all kinds of challenges and stresses in your life. So here's what happens when there's a missing link in your healing journey. When one of these important components I've outlined is missing. Let's say you've got step 1 and 2 down. So you've learnt to embody your neutral spine more of the time, and you're gradually strengthening the surrounding core muscles to balance out the forces acting on the spine. You're likely developing a good resilience to load and starting to feel like you can do a bit more, or you're tolerating your normal activities a bit more. The problem is not incorporating step 3, your hip hinge strategy. It's often difficult to have success with step 2, the strengthening part, because a big part of what helps you to really bias your glutes and your deep hip flexors is learning to move more from your hips. Doing exercises that don't involve a hip hinge is missing a big part of the transformation. But it's also less functional. Learning the hip hinge strategy ultimately is what allows you to be able to do a forward bend on the mat or the myriad of ways that you bend off the mat in your life while harnessing the powerhouse load buffering capacity of your glutes. So you need your hip hinge strategy dialed to really make progress with step 2, your core stability or core strength. And the biggest problem I see is that without this knowledge and understanding of how the hip hinge strategy helps you to buffer loads more effectively, you're more likely to end up flaring up another episode again as soon as you resume your normal life, which ultimately involves a ton of bending. Or another scenario that can happen, and I see this too, is that there's a focus on step 2, your core stability or core strengthening, and step 3, hip hinge training. Maybe you're doing deadlifts at the gym and incorporating a hip hinge strategy. And you're doing a lot of core strengthening for your glutes even and your hip flexors and abdominals. But you haven't incorporated step 1, the neutral spine awareness. And so you may end up overloading your spine with too much spine extension or not enough when you do your deadlifts. And so you end up overloading your low back. So step 1 is super important. We need to get that good neutral spine for effective load buffering so that you don't continually experience overload and more recurring episodes of pain that keep you stuck in the loop of recurring low back pain and failing to make real progress with your goals. What about the situation where there's step 1, neutral spine awareness, and step 3, there's a hip hinge strategy? You're moving from your hips, but you're not doing any of step 2, strengthening work for your core. You're just focusing on the movement shift. Well, in this case, actually, you may still get there eventually because the movement pattern shift would actually slowly encourage the core muscles that are needed to get stronger. The problem is it would be slower and the recovery would likely be a fair bit bumpier. You would likely have more flare-ups along the way before you got there. And probably because of this, you may end up quitting, thinking that it wasn't working. So I'm curious, which one of these 3 is the missing link for you? Now, if it's all 3, that's okay. That's pretty much where most of my clients start their journey, to be honest. So no judgment. It's completely normal to not have any of these 3 components nailed if you're a modern yogi living a modern lifestyle with all of its challenges. You don't know what you don't know. But here's where the rubber meets the road. When you do know and you experience that aha or eureka moment where everything makes sense, you will be faced with the choice to either keep doing what you're doing and hoping something magically changes, or choose empowerment and step off that injury hamster wheel and take aligned action. If you did have any aha moments and you've realized that one or more of these steps has been missing in your recovery journey, I'd love to know which ones. Drop into my DMs on Instagram or Facebook Messenger and let me know which ones you're missing. And if this episode is resonating with you, I'd love it if you could rate this podcast 5 stars and leave me a written review. That is the greatest support you could give to the podcast in helping these teachings reach other yoga lovers like you who may be experiencing similar low back issues. If you want to learn more about how to implement these 3 steps, I invite you to head over to my website and register your interest in finding out more about the Empowered Yogi Method by joining the waitlist. And in the last episode, I shared that I want to leave you with a powerful mantra at the end of each episode to take away that really encapsulates the main teaching. And for this episode, there's actually 2. Remember that you can click in a link in the description below to download a visual affirmation card of these mantras each week. You can download them to your phone wallpaper or print them for your journal. I am in charge of my own healing, and I recognized that my personal power to transform comes from changing the way I am wired. And my brain is neuroplastic and capable of rewiring itself to a new optimized way of moving that allows my body to heal. Now you know the 3 crucial steps for overcoming recurring low back pain on the mat. There's another important lesson that I want to impart in my next episode that ties in really closely to one of these 3 steps. In the next episode, I'll be answering this important question that comes up a lot with my clients working with low back pain. How do I modify my yoga practice? In particular, I'll be unpacking the most important pose to modify in your low back pain recovery journey so that you can feel confident you're doing the right thing for your back on the mat. Thanks for being here, and I'm so excited to continue this journey with you. Namaste.